So today we have a topic focusing on emotions, and especially the role they play in many mental processes and also in social processes. Tomorrow we will have a topic specifically on the social side and also the social side of emotions. And then next week we will continue by addressing the adaptivity, so adaptive networks, and even of the first order and second order on Tuesday and Wednesday. But today is the day of emotions, and also the assignment will be on emotion regulation. I will tell more things about that during the talk that fit to that assignment as well. The idea is from a historical point of view that emotions didn't get a very good treatment by the AI community. So AI, yeah, the word intelligence has had a kind of emphasis in AI for a very long time. So then the general idea was at that time also that emotions, they only disturb cognitive processes. So that you would better not try to include them in your models, because then you model it in the wrong way or so, or in a not ideal way. So that was the time, like in the 60s. But there were already in that time people that really pointed at that it was a serious omission. For example, Neisser from 63. He says that needs and emotions is not just a starting point, but also they continue to operate throughout the whole course of mental processes. And so that has a substantial effect on all intellectual activities. Also, Simon, also a famous person from psychology, he also talks about these motive and emotion things are major influences. So there were already warnings at that time, but they didn't help, because it only in recent years it has changed. Now in today's time, emotion is even a topic on an AI on the most important AI conferences, and just one of the topics of the conference. So it's completely different compared to how it was earlier. And there are some reasons for that. So nowadays, of course, there are topics like virtual agents, avatars, and making them human-like, social robots, or in ambient intelligence applications where you have an app that tries to have an analysis of how the person is doing. And also a second line is the strong development of neuroscience, where you find a lot of info about how emotions really work in the brain, and that it doesn't work as a disturbing contribution usually, but more as a constructive one. So today we will focus around a number of questions. We will try to come also with computational models in the sense of networks that work for emotions. One question is the feeling coming first and affects then an expressed emotion, or is it the other way around, that you first have an expressed emotion and then you get a feeling about it? Is it possible, and in which way is it possible to control emotion? Yeah, of course, that's generally thought that it is possible, but then the question is how? And how far are things like sensing or believing related to feeling, and how does desiring relate to feeling? And what are the impacts of especially negative or stressful emotions? There are still a bit more. Having experience with something, how does that relate to experiencing emotions? Because emotions are typically things that you experience. And concerning the decision-making area, is it possible to make decisions without feeling good about it? And in the social side, in how far is it possible as an individual in a group to be free in having your own emotions? So these are a lot of questions, and most of them we will address in some depth, maybe not always in the most depth. So in emotions, cyclic connections play a role in many brain processes, and especially when emotions are involved, we will see soon. So these types of linear patterns that you go from sensing to sensory processing to preparing and acting, that's only a small part of the whole story. We already have seen that you have actions, cycles between coming to actions before you decide to do it, like the predicting of the effect in what an action will bring you. So these are typically cycles, and these types of cycles indeed apply also to emotions very strongly. So let's see here. The classical view on emotions is, in principle, it was, and maybe you should say it like that, that first you feel an emotion because of what you see, what you sense, then you prepare for a reaction on it, and then you express the emotion. So the feeling comes before the emotion. Already a very long time ago, William James, in his famous book, he claimed a different direction of causality. He says it is as follows. The first part is the same. And also this is not, this looks the same, but it's not exactly the same, because the felt emotion is not there yet. As if it's you trigger already the preparation for your bodily change. For example, somebody smiles at you, and you already have the impulse to smile before you feel anything. That's what his claim is. And then you express the smile in his approach. Then you sense your body state. You feel the smile on your face through your sensing facilities in your skin, for example, and your muscles, and anywhere else in your body. And then you make a representation of your body state, your changed body state, so the representation of the smile, and then that makes you feel it. That is the opposite way of doing according to James. So you don't have the feeling before, but after you express the emotion. So this was already a long time ago one view that was a bit known, but still the majority was thinking about from this type of pattern. But Damasio, he is a famous neuroscientist. He started to address this issue in a more effective way, and after him also more people, and became in support of that type of perspective. So he said that emotion and feeling, they are some kind of cyclic process where emotions are related to actions. So this world of actions carried out in our bodies from facial expressions. So that looks a bit like James also suggests. And then feelings has relation to perception. So that's how you sense your body. And that's in fact, the word feeling and sensing is even a bit close to each other. But so you get some things, you get the perceptions executed in brain maps. So in brain maps, you keep track of what your body is, how your body states are. And then you have certain ways of these feelings to develop. That's his perspective. But until now, it may look a little bit like James, but it's not exactly, because he also allows what is called as-if body loops, while the other things are called body loops. I will come to that in a moment. So this, again, he talks about the emotion feeling cycles, where it begins in the brain by the emotion triggered, and then it returns to the brain via the body to have the feeling. But so this is another citation with the same idea, that it's a repeated circling through that cycle. But he made some additional contribution, that he introduced the notion of as if body loop. He says, well, actually, you don't need to do the expression of the emotion. The preparation is already a good basis to do. So this was what James would propose. He follows the first steps in the same way, but then the next step, not to express the emotion. Instead, he goes to the sensory representation of a changed body state. So this is what we also found already earlier, a form of internal simulation. You imagine as if you change your body state, but you don't change it. So you are playing poker, you have very good cards, and then you feel a smile, you prepare for a smile, but you don't show the smile, but you still feel it because you prepare for it. So that's how it would work then. So then the felt emotion is based on the sensory representation of the body state, where the body state itself doesn't need to actually have changed. So that's his innovation that he contributed. And after that, this whole idea of the role of the body becomes much more popular in the literature. So this, you can call this an internally simulated body change. Well, you can already imagine that many of these things, we can just model them in causal networks. And we will do that. So the general idea then is that you have a sensory representation from some stimulus, you get a preparation of bodily response on that, then you create a new sensory representation of that body state, and that's the basis for the feeling. And you can even continue such type of patterns. So the as if body loop is this, but you still can also have the expression, and then you have what is called the body loop. That's what James described. So the a model for that can just be done like this. We have a sensor state, an SS state, and then a sensory representation state, a preparation state, a PS, and then you have this sensory representation of the body that is the basis for the feeling. Well, here I just put the feeling directly there, and then it is like that. Also, the feeling itself can add to the emotion, so that's not excluded. It's still possible that the feeling has such an additional effect. So that's already a small model for emotion and feeling. So then this is just cycling in a certain way. So this, you can see that as representing, this is responding, this is feeling, and this is amplifying, if you want to have labels on these connections. So this is just a bidirectional influence. So if you model this type of model, if you simulate it, then you get it can continue, can come up the emotion. If you stop the stimulus, it can go down. The stimulus goes to 0, then it goes down. Such patterns, you can expect it if you simulate such type of model. I think you already are skillful enough to do that rather easily, to model this. So then next step, and that's a very important area, and especially nowadays, is emotion regulation. It has been found out that in many cases, people can have long-term stress and then get certain disorders that are implied by such long-term stress. I don't want to say that students are the only one who have long-term stress, but of course you also know stress when you have exams and those types of things. So in which ways is it possible to control or regulate your emotion? And usually people think that it means that you suppress the emotional response, for example, by expressing a poker face. Of course, that sometimes can happen, but that's not the only way, and certainly not the best way to regulate your emotion, because this can be very unhealthy, because internally you still have this stressed state. So there are also other mechanisms, and I will discuss a few of them soon. And for example, you can just close your eyes, like here a little bit maybe. Or you can avoid some person and just go away. These are also counting as emotion regulation. Even they are more healthy forms. If somebody always provokes stress or aggression in you, because the person is aggressive, for example, then why always expose yourself to that person or expose that person to you? So you better avoid it. So Cross is a famous name in this area of emotion regulation. And he's distinguished where in the causal pathways through the emotion you want to modify things, you regulate things. So there is a causal pathway to an emotion state. There is also a causal pathway from it, and maybe there are multiple even of them. So what are the causal pathways through an emotion state? The ones toward and from an emotion state. And then he distinguished two types of emotion regulation. One, then when you address the causal pathway before you enter the emotion state, so that cause the emotion state. That is, he calls that antecedent focused regulation. And you can think of the selection and modification of the world situation, like I mentioned already, just go away. But also attentional deployment, then you don't go away, but you try to distract your attention to something else, to look somewhere else, for example. But also reappraisal is an issue, an option. That's even part of the assignment of today in the advanced part of the assignment. That means that you change your interpretation. I will come back to them in a bit more detail. And for the other ones, the response-focused regulation, then that means that you are in the area of suppression of the emotional response, and of maybe a bit of the preparation for it, but at least the expression and the feeling. So in fact, when you do that, you are a bit too late, but in some cases you still have to do that. Better is to already do regulate in that area, in the antecedent focused area. So there is in the literature a lot of attention for the amygdala prefrontal cortex interaction. So via intermediate steps, there are a lot of links connecting them in both directions. So there is a lot of knowledge that points at the role of the prefrontal cortex in the control or the regulation of the feelings and the emotions, and especially the amygdala that represents them. So that's some things that have been found are that lower activity of this part of the prefrontal cortex correlates to a higher activity of the amygdala. That means a higher level of negative emotions in principle here. And also, if you do REM sleep, then it strengthens both the prefrontal cortex activity in that area and also reduces amygdala activity. These two suggest that the connection upward from amygdala to this area in the prefrontal cortex is a very important connection. So if that connection is not strong enough, then you will not activate this prefrontal cortex area. And then therefore you will not be suppressing your amygdala. So this suggests that if you want to have some idea of how good is your emotion regulation mechanism, then the upward links are a good focus to focus on. I will come back to that later, I think also in the case of learning next week. So then they are just good suitable components just to have biological counterpart of emotion state and also a control state for regulation that we have to introduce in our models. So we already had this for, say, a very simple model for emotion and feeling. We add a control state, and this control state should be informed, of course, that there is emotion, otherwise it is blind. So therefore you need incoming connections. from different sides. So you need to monitor the feeling and your emotional response preparation, and perhaps also what stimulus is causing it. So these are monitoring connections for the control state. And as I said on the previous slide, these are very important connections, because if people have problems in controlling their emotions or regulating them, often it is because these connections are too weak. So strengthening them can help them. So the effect of control has to be, it has to affect other things. So these are typically not antecedent focused, but already on the existing preparation and feeling, the effect on the regulation. And then you can also regulate towards the other one that are before the emotion. And then this is already an emotion regulation loop here. But you can also extend it to places here that you also see what do I see? This is monitoring what you actually see. And then you can also say, no, I look at it in another direction, which also affects your attention. If you don't look at something, the attention also goes more away. But also even you can monitor where am I? I am in a very crowded place, a very noisy restaurant, for example. Then decide I move to another restaurant. So that's also, these are all of these antecedent focused strategies, and these are just response focused. So you have a lot of possibilities if you want to model emotion regulation, because you can address all of these or some of them. And I didn't even mention the reappraisal here, because that's not yet in this model. So that gives a lot of space to think about how to work on emotion regulation. So now a few words about the reappraisal. As I said, this will be the topic of the advanced part of the assignment of today. Reappraisal means that you try to change your interpretation of a stimulus. Maybe a stimulus looks at forehand very stressful, and then you feel stressed about it and negative. Maybe you feel sad or angry. But sometimes you can just have also other interpretations. For example, suppose you fail for an exam. The first interpretation can be, oh, that will cost me a lot of extra work. So that's the negative interpretation. But maybe you can also think about a positive interpretation. If I would have passed now, it would have been a 6 or lower even, a very low grade. And if I can do it later, I can have a higher grade. So that would be a positive interpretation. So this is just an example. You should not, it's not the idea that this is the only way to do it, but to illustrate the whole thing. Now, in cases that you have this negative interpretation, usually from the stimulus, the representation of the stimulus, both of them are triggered, the positive and the negative, but only the negative is triggered more. It has a stronger link from the stimulus. So therefore you have this stronger, but you also have usually that they are not going well together, that they are competing, so that they have mutually suppressing links between the two. So if this is high, it will suppress that one. If this is high, it will suppress that one. So if that means that if this is activated a little bit more than that by the sensor connection, censoring, the sensor state, as a stimulus, then this is higher than that, and therefore this mutual suppressing will win. So therefore it will suppress this more down. Now what should be done by emotion regulation is that you try to suppress this one, this belief, that you try to say, yeah, but that's not a good belief, I can better forget about it. And then you have an additional control state that suppresses that one. And then because of, again, of this mutual suppressing, now the BS2 is the stronger one, because this has an extra suppressing factor. So therefore now this comes up and wins the competition, and thereby, therefore you don't have the negative feelings anymore that are triggered by the negative belief. So this pattern is the pattern that is for the advanced part of the assignment today. I will come back to it at the end when but this is basically what I want to say about it. So that's another one that was not in the previous picture. There is a lot of literature that shows how stressful life, very long-term stress affects your health, both mentally and physically. You can find topics on that even if you want to model that. So these are suggestions that may be suggestions for your final assignment. You can just read it and check it. So now I want just to briefly indicate some other things with emotions. And one of the things is that cognitive states and affective states have often interaction together. Just on one side, anything you believe that triggers some emotion in general. So that's one side. So also here there is something from Frida. It's a psychologist from Amsterdam. So these emotions, beliefs are just having influence on emotions, but on the other hand, that emotions also have influence on beliefs. So therefore we have a cyclic connection between emotions and beliefs. So there's another author, Phelps, that also say that they are all, in all stages, they have influence on each other. So these are things that you can also add in your model. For example, we add a cognitive state here. We add for example, a belief, an interpretation of the stimulus, and then it triggers some emotion. And this emotion itself, is the feeling for it, for example, affects your cognitive state as well. You can model it in such types of ways. So these are all kind of suggestions that you can apply if you want to model such processes. So this is, you can call this emotion integration. You integrate your emotions in your cognitive system. Also, one or two words about decision making. So the appreciation of positive functions served by emotions also applies to decision making. So could you make an adequate decision without having a good feeling about it? Maybe you can try, but as soon as any slight occasion occurs, maybe you will withdraw your decision, change your decision if you are not feeling well about it. The feeling for a decision is a very important factor. First, to come to the decision, but also to keep committed to your decision. It is also known in the literature that if patients have brain damage that make this emotion disappear, there is a famous patient that even doesn't have an amygdala. And there are many things that have been tried out on her. And then they are not able to make up their mind. They're always changing their mind. They're always doubting, shall I do this or shall I do that? So these emotions are a very strong and important grounding thing for your decisions. Then you can make kind of things like this. You have a preparation state for an option, for a decision, this option, an action that you may choose. You predict the effect like we did earlier, like in the ice cream example. What would happen when I would decide for this action? Then the effect triggers an emotion, and that triggers a feeling. Then this feeling serves as a form of valuation for the action, and it has then an effect on the action. So you evaluate what is the effect. You first determine what would be the effect of this action. Then you evaluate what feeling would give that to me, and then you feed it back to the preparation. If the feeling is good, then you would increase the strength of this, and otherwise not. So that's already a simple model for having the emotions involved in decision making. So then you have a valuing loop here. In book 1, chapter 6, there is a whole chapter about it. I think the title is something like Emotions as a Vehicle for Rational Behavior, or Rational Decision, or Rationality. So, there is also some other literature that relates emotions to adaptation. If you are in a very stressful situation, it has been found that you weaken your connections then. And that's a bit strange because, well, if your connections are weaker, it's difficult to do something. And you can wonder why, because the brain has developed in so many years as a very good device, why do they do these bad things? But after all, it turns out it's not so bad at all. Because if you have a really stressful situation, then that usually means that you don't have already available good habits to address that situation. So that means that all things that you learned in the past do not apply anymore. And that's the reason why it is so very stressful, because you lack tools to handle it. So then if you weaken your existing connections, then you get rid easier from your earlier habits and earlier types of responses. And then it's easier to learn new things. So that in that sense, it just makes sense that this happens. So that's also, there is some literature about that. You can also model that. So finally, there is something in relation to the social functioning. Of course, on tomorrow, I will have more to say about social contagion. I just mentioned now already, you have two persons then. One has a stimulus, and then it shows emotion, and then the person shows B also because another person shows that emotion. So then you have these types of connections, but I will not go into detail here because that will be more the topic of tomorrow. So instead, I will now say a few words about the assignment for today. So the emotion regulation, for this case, a part of the model that I showed earlier is only addressed, this one, this part. Yeah, that's all. So that's the suppressing side of regulation. So this is the basic part of the assignment, to model this, to make a model for this. Remember that this control state is suppressing the feeling. And in assignment 1, we also had something like that, that we are suppressing Mark's anger. You remember that, how that happened? Then we had also some state doing that, and that was actually the sadness of Jenny. So you could say in the example of yesterday, the sadness of Jenny served as a form of control state for Mark's feeling. And you could even look back how you did, you solved that. You can use the same type of pattern even. So that's one observation I want to suggest. Then, yeah, I don't want to tell much about it further. You have to just experience it yourself. And then the basic part is, I think, relatively easy to do if you have the experience of yesterday already. For the advanced part, and you can see back also this slide that I already had about it, it's a bit more work probably. So you might choose not to do it if you think it's too complicated for you. But it has a challenge, of course. So then you have to find out how you can let these belief states suppress each other, so that they can, you have this competition between them. That's a kind of interesting challenge, you can say. And by the way, this idea of mutually competing states, that also plays a role in many consciousness theories. Consciousness theories, they usually assume that, let's say, more than 90% of the things in the brain are unconscious. But among all these things that are unconsciously active in the brain, there is a competition which one will become conscious. And this type of mechanism that you can apply here between these two beliefs, you can also apply that to model a form of consciousness by having the winner become conscious. So that's a side remark here. It's not part of the assignment in this case. I think this is all. So maybe you have some questions now or not.